Welcome, brave seekers of history and wisdom, to a tale carved into the very stone of medieval Europe. Today, we journey back nearly 1,000 years to a battlefield where dust and blood mingled beneath the blazing Italian sun. The year is Itzenling-Wurdersan, the place, Civitate, a small town that suddenly found itself at the crossroads of faith, and destiny. Here, knights clad in iron, Norman adventurers from distant lands, and the Pope's own army clashed in a thunderous contest that would reshape Christendom. This was no ordinary skirmish. It was the Battle of Civitate, a conflict where loyalty was tested, alliances shattered, and the weight of belief itself was carried upon the edge of a sword. In this journey, you won't just watch history, you will feel it. You will ride with the Norman cavalry, hear the clash of steel, and stand shoulder to shoulder with warriors who believed their cause was divinely ordained. So tighten your grip, steady your spirit, and prepare for a saga of ambition, faith, and courage. The Battle of Civitate awaits, and its echoes still call to us today. Welcome to the battlefield of history. Here's a dramatic hook you can place right after your welcome. Imagine the roar of thousands of hooves, the air thick with smoke, the cries of men who knew that victory meant salvation and defeat meant eternal shame. On that June day, in Itzenling-Wurdersan, a storm of steel and faith descended upon Civitate, and the world would never be the same. Subscribe for more history, like and comment if you believe history should never be forgotten, and share to spark conversation about the lessons we must learn from the past. This is not myth, this is history. And it begins here. The 7th century was a Europe on edge. Kingdoms fractured, faith shaken, power shifting like sand beneath a soldier's feet. To the north, the Holy Roman Empire sought to extend its reach. To the west, the Papacy in Rome dreamed of spiritual supremacy over all Christendom. To the south, the Byzantine Empire clung to its Italian outposts, even as new forces stirred restlessly in the shadows. Among these forces were the Normans, descendants of Norsemen who had abandoned the longship for the horse and the castle. Once Vikings, now lords, they carried with them ambition as sharp as their swords. Southern Italy became their stage, a land of rich soil, divided rulers, and endless opportunity. But opportunity breeds enemies. The Pope, Leo IX, feared the Normans as raiders and usurpers. To him, they were wolves devouring Christendom. He resolved to stop them, not with prayer alone, but with the sword. Thus, the stage was set. Two powers, the Church and the Normans, marching toward confrontation. And at the heart of this collision stood a small town, Civitate. Its name would echo through the centuries, whispered in both triumph and shame. This was the world on the eve of battle, restless, divided, and ready to ignite. Long before they became masters of Italy, the Normans were wanderers. Born of the north, their ancestors had carved their way into history with axe and sail. They raided coasts, burned villages, and demanded tribute. But something remarkable happened. In the land of the Franks, the Norsemen settled. They became Christians, built fortresses, and intermarried with locals. From Vikings, they transformed into Normans, the men of Normandy. Generations passed, but the fire of ambition never cooled. Sons of lords without land looked southward, to the warm hills of Italy. There, Lombards, Byzantines, Saracens, and popes warred endlessly. For the restless Norman knights, it was a land of promise. Among them was Robert Guiscard, tall and fierce, a man whose very name, the Cunning, spoke of his ruthless brilliance. His brothers, too, sought glory, forging a dynasty of steel. These Normans were no longer marauders. They were rulers in the making, carving castles upon foreign hills, commanding men through both fear and loyalty. They were the storm approaching Italy, and the world had yet to realize its fury. Southern Italy in the 8th century was a chessboard of power. The Byzantines still clung to coastal cities. The Lombards ruled inland duchies, and Saracens prowled from Sicily. Into this chaos rode the Normans, first as mercenaries, then as conquerors. Humphrey of Hauteville, brother of Robert Guiscard, became one of the Norman leaders in Italy. His men were disciplined, armored in chainmail, and known for their thunderous cavalry charges. Local rulers hired them as allies, only to see their mercenaries turn into masters. The Italian lords underestimated them. Where they sought payment, the Normans sought dominion. They built fortresses, imposed taxes, and declared themselves rightful rulers. Humphrey himself emerged as Count of Apulia, carving out land once thought beyond Norman reach. But word spread. To Rome, the Norman presence was an infection. To Pope Leo IX, their advance was intolerable. He would not allow wolves in shepherd's clothing to dominate Italy. Thus, the Normans' call to adventure was answered with the Pope's call to arms. Their fate was bound to a reckoning. The march to Civitate, in the heart of Rome, beneath the shadow of St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Leo IX contemplated war. A reformer and a man of unyielding faith, he had fought tirelessly against corruption within the church. Now he faced a new enemy, the Normans. To the Pope, they were lawless brigands, warriors who pretended piety while plundering Christian lands. His vision was of a united Christendom, bound not by kings or dukes, but by the authority of the church. And the Normans, unchecked, threatened that vision. Leo IX did not hesitate. He summoned allies, Swabian knights from Germany, Lombard militias and volunteers who believed they fought for God's justice. In letters and sermons, he called upon the faithful, promising heavenly reward for earthly struggle. The papacy was no longer a spiritual throne alone. It was a commander's seat. The Pope donned no armor, but his blessing was as potent as any sword. His enemies would soon learn that Rome could rally not only prayers, but armies. The Pope's call resounded across the land, and men answered. From Germany came armored Swabian knights, tall and disciplined. From Lombardy came foot soldiers with spears and shields. From Rome itself came priests, bearing relics to inspire the host. This was no ordinary army. It was a coalition bound not by oaths to a king, but by loyalty to the vicar of Christ. Their cause was holy, their mission divine, to crush the Normans and restore God's peace to Italy. As the banners rose and the soldiers assembled, a sense of righteousness filled the air. Priests moved among the ranks, sprinkling holy water, reminding each man that his sword was God's will. But beneath the hymns and blessings, doubts stirred. Some wondered if this war was truly just, or if the Pope sought not peace but power. Yet, those questions were drowned in the sound of trumpets and marching feet. The army of the faithful was born, and it would march to Civitate. While the Pope's armies marched under holy banners, the Normans prepared with grim determination. For them, this was no divine crusade. It was survival. They had carved out their holdings in southern Italy through blood and steel, and they would not surrender them to Rome. Robert Guiscard, Humphrey of Hauteville, and Richard of Aversa united their forces. Though rivalry often burned among the Norman lords, the threat of annihilation bound them together. They drilled their cavalry, inspected weapons, and reinforced their fortresses. Scouts reported the Pope's coalition was vast, yet numbers had never frightened the Normans. Better a few lions than 1,000 sheep, Robert is said to have declared. His knights believed it. They trusted in their heavy cavalry. The thunder of hooves and the fear their charges struck into the hearts of lesser men. By firelight, the Normans swore oaths. They would not bend. Civitate, a small Lombard town, would be their battleground, and there they would prove whether destiny favored Rome or Normandy. The Pope's coalition began its march south. From the plains of Lombardy through winding Italian roads, the banners of Christendom advanced. Villagers watched in awe and fear as thousands of armed men passed by, their armor gleaming under the sun. Swabian knights led the vanguard, disciplined, methodical, and proud. Behind them, Lombard footmen trudged with spears and shields. Priests marched among them, chanting hymns, raising crucifixes high above the ranks. Every step carried weight, for this was not merely an army of men, but an army of God. Or so they believed. Their purpose was righteous, their confidence absolute. The Normans would be crushed beneath the Pope's blessing. Yet, as the army pressed onward, rumors whispered among the ranks. Tales of Norman ferocity, of cavalry charges that split armies like wheat before the scythe. Some soldiers prayed more fervently, others gripped their weapons tighter. The march was slow, but the Pope's army pressed on. Southward they moved towards Civitate, where destiny awaited. By June of Wusersan, both armies drew closer to Civitate. The Lombard town, unaware of its fate, became the center of a storm. Farmers and merchants fled, seeking safety from the thunder of armies. The Normans, fewer in number, moved swiftly, their cavalry cutting across the countryside. They knew the terrain, exploiting every hill and river. Scouts returned with reports of the Pope's immense host, far larger than their own. But fear was absent from Norman camps. Their leaders inspired confidence, reminding the men that discipline and ferocity outweighed sheer numbers. The Pope's army, meanwhile, slowed under its own weight. Thousands of soldiers, supply wagons, and priests stretched for miles. Confidence still burned, but cracks appeared, quarrels between Lombard militias, arrogance among the German knights, suspicion of Norman cunning. Both armies now converged upon Civitate. The town would not merely witness a battle, it would become a legend, written in blood. As the armies neared, the villages surrounding Civitate trembled. For the peasants, war meant not glory, but terror. Families abandoned homes, seeking shelter in woods and hills. Livestock was driven off, crops left to rot. Smoke rose where frightened villagers burned their own fields, rather than leave them to armies. The Normans demanded supplies, their knights taking grain and cattle. Though feared, they paid when possible, knowing they needed the goodwill, or at least the silence, of locals. The Pope's soldiers, however, saw themselves as liberators, demanding service in the name of God. Some peasants submitted willingly, others grumbled in secret. Fear spread as rumors grew. The Pope has brought an army as countless as the stars, some said. Others whispered of Norman knights who could cut 10 men down in a single charge. Caught between two mighty hosts, the common folk of Civitate learned that war was not fought only on battlefields. It was etched into their very survival. By June Shirchi, both armies faced one another near Civitate. The town, perched on its hill, watched in silence as thousands of men encamped in fields below. For a brief moment, time seemed to hold its breath. The Pope's army vastly outnumbered the Normans. Confident, they feasted and sang hymns by firelight. German knights polished armor, Lombards sharpened spears, priests assured the men of divine victory. Their camp glowed with certainty. Across the field, the Norman camp was smaller, quieter. There was no boasting, no hymns, only preparation. Horses were brushed, weapons inspected, and leaders spoke in low, steady tones. The Normans knew what awaited them. That night, stars shone coldly over Civitate. Some soldiers prayed, others wept silently. The morning would decide the fate of Italy. Would the Pope's host crush the Norman upstarts? Or would the thunder of cavalry change history? The air was thick with destiny. Dawn would bring war. Dawn bled across the fields below Civitate, washing mail and spear points in a pale, forgiving light that would not last. Before either banner committed its full strength, the morning belonged to the shadows between the lines. Scouts, outriders, and the nervous bravado of men trying to measure an enemy without yet gambling their souls. Norman horsemen moved first, pricking at the edges of the papal line. They rode in twos and threes, lances upright, kicking dust into the faces of Lombard pikemen who bristled behind their shields. The horsemen did not tarry. They darted, taunted, withdrew. Arrows loosed from the papal side traced lazy arcs, thudding into the turf or finding unlucky targets with an ugly, flat sound. Humphrey of Hauteville watched from a low rise, eyes narrowed, counting the rhythm of response in the papal host. To the German center, grim Swabians in long mail with heavy kite shields. These pinpricks were a nuisance. They kept their order, disciplined as stone, but the Lombard militias, proud and eager for favor in Rome, surged forward in little waves. A trumpet would sound, a line would shuffle, then drift back, the pattern repeated, until the edges of the coalition line looked frayed. On the Norman flank, Robert Guiscard spoke softly to a standard bearer. "Find me where they are most offended," he said, "and keep offending them." Another flight of arrows slid from the papal side. The Norman riders drew back just beyond their bite, then spurred in again to strike a courier, to steal a banner length of ground. Priests moved among the papal ranks, lifting reliquaries. A murmur of prayer rose and fell. For every Norman feint, a blessing answered. For every arrow, a sign of the cross. Confidence held, but the morning was writing small footnotes. That afternoon would make into chapters. By mid-morning, the skirmishes had taught both sides something they would not forget. The Normans learned where the Lombards were quick to anger and slow to reform. The papal commanders learned that the enemy's horse would not simply charge and die. They would measure and pry and hunt for the softest seam. And Civitate, watching from its hill, learned that the day's wooing was over. Soon the marriage of iron would begin. When the scouts returned, mud to their knees and confidence in their voices, the Norman council gathered around a rough map, etched with a dagger into sun-dried dirt. Humphrey spoke first, the elder calm. "Their strength is the German center. Their weakness is pride and distance on the Lombard wings." Robert Guiscard folded his arms. "Then we feed them what they most desire," he said. "We show the Lombards a victory they cannot refuse." Richard of Aversa grinned, a fox-scenting henhouse. He would take the right, he said, and ride hard at the Lombards until their lines flushed forward, shouting glory. Humphrey would fix the Swabians, refusing the temptation to overreach. Robert would hold a reserve, striking where the fabric tore widest. They spoke of signals, a triple trumpet for a feigned recoil, a single long note for the hammer to fall. No grand speeches, just hard arithmetic, space, time, angles. Short reins on hot horses, tight ranks. No man to break formation for plunder. If anyone chases too far, Humphrey warned, he will find himself praying in German. Laughter, brief, tense, human, broke the stillness. Messengers flowed outward. Captains repeated the plan, simple enough to hold in memory. Even when panic tried to erase the slate, lances were checked for splinters, girths for weakness, helms for fit. The reserve, Robert's chosen, tightened their chin straps in silence. They were the lid on the cauldron. When it rattled, they would clamp it shut. Across the field, the papal line buzzed with its own counsels. But the Normans did not need to hear them. They already knew the conversation, the Lombards, demanding the honor of first blood, the Germans, insisting on order, the priests promising that God would make straight what men bent. The Normans did not pray less. They simply placed their faith in momentum, leverage, and the courage to ride again after the first collision. Humphrey ended the council with a low voice that carried, "Hold your nerve. The enemy is many, but the ground is only so wide. We are few, but the road to their hearts is narrow. Ride straight on it." Banners dipped. Men took their places. The orchestra of war waited for the conductor's baton. If doubt walked the papal camp, it wore soft shoes. What strode openly was confidence. Heavia's plate bright as polished helms. The coalition had come to civitate with the Pope's blessing and with numbers that could swallow valleys. Hymns threaded through the ranks. Standards of cities and dioceses lifted in the fickle breeze like a field of wildflowers. In the center, the Swabians made a fortress of bodies. They were veterans, disciplined, scarred, with a sober hate for chaos. Their captains paced like shepherds with iron crooks, counting ranks, tapping shield rims to attune the men's breath. "Hold," they told them. "Hold, and the day is ours." Duce. On the wings, the Lombards wore pride like a second surcoat. They had been first to answer Rome's call. First, to march the long roads south. They wanted the poem and the pay. To them, the Normans were swaggering brigands, hoarse thieves with gaudy banners. The Lombard lords argued good-naturedly over precedence, over who would be seen at the decisive moment. Priests moved through the alleys of men, sensing the air until it smelled like a forest fire in a cathedral. They held out splinters of the true cross, silvered reliquaries, pages of saints, bones, all the delicate, burning things that make men brave. "Fear not," one cleric whispered to a boy soldier who shook despite himself. "The Mother of God rides with us." The boy nodded, swallowed, and tightened his grip. Messengers negotiated between ambition and order. The German captains demanded that the center set the tempo. The Lombards pressed to advance before the enemy's devil horse could work its tricks. A compromise, always a compromise, settled like dust after a march. Positions were fixed, signals agreed. As the sun rose higher, the papal commanders surveyed their enemy with the generous contempt of the well-supplied. The Norman camp looked small, their cavalry a glittering but narrow blade against a shield wall that seemed to stretch forever. "They will break," someone said. Heads nodded. They always do. Confidence is a road whose last mile looks exactly like the previous ones, until it drops, without warning, into a gorge. But from where the papal host stood on its fine highway, the gorge was invisible. By late morning, the field had become a diagram. Lines, intervals, anchors, human geometry traced with breath and fear. Civitate sat behind the papal host like a silent sponsor, its walls watching, its gates shut. Beyond the Normans, the low undulations of the Apulian countryside offered little cover. Only the measured rise and fall that makes a charge seemed to climb and descend like a wave. Humphrey placed his center opposite the Swabians, fewer men, more horse. He wanted their eyes. Richard took the Norman right, angled toward the Lombard wing that most often fluttered under the skirmishers' teasing. Robert's reserve sat back on a gentle swell, half hidden by distance, fresh as a promise. In the papal order, the Germans stood like a bookend around which the shelves refused to warp. Their long spears, their tight shields, their unstartled faces. Every detail said, "Spend your courage here and watch it by nothing." To their left and right, the Lombards bristled, colorful and eager, an orchard, heavy with fruit that begged to be shaken. Standards dipped, trumpets exchanged questions and answers. The space between armies steadied, a taut rope, humming with wind. Men said last words meant for families far away. Others spat to wet, dry tongues. Some laughed too loudly because silence sounded like a tomb. The first ranks lowered lances. Horses snorted, stamped, asked their riders with animal hearts whether this nonsense was really necessary. The riders squeezed calves and settled deeper in the saddle, and the horses, being loyal fools, agreed. On the signal, Humphrey told his banner, not before, not late. The banner nodded, as though it could. Across the way a German captain thumped his shield once, twice, 3 times. His men answered, the sound traveling down the line like stones dropped in a cistern. There are moments before battle when the world simplifies. A man becomes a line between 2 points, his lance tip and a throat. The complexity of faith and politics fades to the physics of contact. The field at Civitate reached that clarity. If the gods of men watch from above, this is what they come to see, where the flesh will do what iron demands. The note began as breath and became fate. A long commanding call rolled along the Norman front, and the line stepped forward as if pulled by a chain. Hooves dug, tails lashed. The first stride a question, the second an argument, the third an oath. Then the ground itself seemed to move. One body of horse and men leaning into the future. Richard of Aversa led the right with a hunter's smile. He aimed not at the firm middle of the papal host, but at the proud Lombard edge, where morning skirmishes had frayed discipline. His first shock was not full, just enough to bite, to make the Lombards taste splinters and want revenge. Lances shattered, men toppled, horses screamed, and then, at the second trumpet, short, urgent, the Norman right recoiled in good order, dust cloaking intention. The Lombards did what pride and heat had scripted. They surged. Lines bulged forward like a barrel's staves under pressure. Banners pitched ahead, officers waving swords, men shouting that the Normans ran. They ran not at all. They arched. A door cleverly left ajar. In the center, Humphrey pressed closer to the Swabians, never offering the clean impact that the Germans desired. He circled, probed, threw javelins into shield faces, then slid away as if the ground were greased. The Swabians stalked him steadily, never breaking rank, a grindstone waiting for a blade. Robert's reserve watched everything. He measured the Lombard swell, the German patience, the breath of his own mounts. When the third signal, a triple peal, cut the air like a bright knife, he raised his sword and pointed where Richard's feigned retreat had drawn the Lombards into a long tongue of ambition. Now, he said, not shouted, said they came like weather. The reserve rolled down the shallow slope and struck the stretched Lombard flank on its hinge. What had looked like a glorious advance became a hinge ripped from its doorpost. Men collided. Voices changed key from triumph to astonishment. The Norman right, which had been retreating, wheeled, disciplined, practiced, and drove back in, a mouth closed on meat. Across the field, the Swabians saw the danger and tried to step in, but their very strength, cohesion, made speed impossible. Humphrey denied them, always just far enough to lure, and just close enough to threaten. The papal center could not rescue its wing without forfeiting its soul. Dust, sunlight, iron, breath. Trumpets answered with drums, prayers with curses, courage with more courage. The battle had truly begun, and already the story bent. It did not snap yet. That would take more charges, more grit. But the bend was visible, a sapling under a hand that knew how wood remembers pressure. The trumpet's call became thunder as Norman hooves struck earth in unison. Dust boiled upward, swallowing the sun in a haze of gold and gray. Every heartbeat pounded to the rhythm of horses driving forward. An avalanche of muscle, iron, and will. Robert Guiscard's reserve, now unleashed, thundered into the Lombard flank, with a force that seemed to shake the bones of the earth. Shields cracked, men screamed. Standards fell and rose again, then toppled for good, as the Norman wedge punched deeper. Richard of Aversa wheeled his contingent back in perfect coordination. What had looked like a rout became a trap. His men slammed into the already buckling Lombards. From the front, panic spread through the papal wing, like fire through dry brush. Some Lombards fought desperately, bracing with spears, but cavalry tore gaps too wide to close. Others turned, running for Civitate, their cries drowning beneath the roar of charging horses. Humphrey of Hauteville, watching from the center, pressed his own riders forward to keep the Germans pinned. He knew if the Swabians advanced unchecked, they might crush his smaller force. Before Robert's breakthrough could decide the day, the Norman charge was not a single blow, but a rhythm, a pounding drum that broke men with each beat. They would recoil, regroup, and strike again. The field became a furnace where Lombard courage melted into chaos. For the Normans, this was the moment their discipline proved greater than numbers. So, for the papal army, it was the first undeniable sign that victory was slipping through their fingers. Amid the chaos of the collapsing Lombard wing, one bastion remained firm: the German knights. Tall, ironclad, their kite shields locked tight, they advanced like a wall. Their discipline, forged in the Empire's wars, made them unyielding. The Norman charges battered against them, but unlike the Lombards, the Germans did not break. Spears caught horses mid-gallop, tumbling riders to the ground. Lances shattered against shields. The Swabians fought not like militia, but like stone given breath. Humphrey hurled his men against them again and again. Each clash rattled bones. Each push met with a counterstroke. The Germans fought shoulder to shoulder, their line advancing slowly, methodically. For every Norman knight unhorsed, they closed ranks, spears bristling like a forest. Robert saw it and grimaced. "They will not fall like the others," he said. "They must be ground down." The Germans' resistance became the anvil against which the entire battle rang. The papal center refused to die. Though their wings faltered, the Swabians' grim stand gave hope to those still fighting. For the Normans, victory demanded endurance. The clash with the Germans turned the battlefield into a grinder. Men fell, rose, and fell again. Horses screamed, iron clanged, and the fight against the Swabians stretched into a brutal test of will. While the Germans held firm, the Lombards were undone. The Norman wedge had torn them open, and now chaos reigned. Commanders shouted orders no one obeyed. Trumpets sounded in vain. Men threw down spears and fled toward Civitate's gates, pounding on the doors for safety. Some Lombards rallied briefly, desperate to restore honor. They formed small clusters, fighting with spears and shields against Norman cavalry that swirled around them like wolves circling prey. But courage without order is only sacrifice. One after another, these knots of resistance broke, their banners trampled into the dirt. Villagers on Civitate's walls watched in horror as the Pope's proud allies dissolved before their eyes. The Norman horsemen pursued relentlessly, cutting down those who ran, trampling men beneath hooves. Smoke and dust obscured faces, turning friend and foe alike into shadows. The papal commanders shouted for order, signaling the Germans to hold their ground while the Lombards regrouped. But it was useless. The Lombard wing was gone, broken beyond repair. For the papal army, half the battle was already lost. For the Normans, it was a chance to tighten their grip. The battlefield now tilted. With the Lombards shattered, the Normans began to encircle the remaining papal forces. Richard's cavalry swept wide, cutting off retreat. Robert pushed deeper, forcing survivors into the Swabians' rigid block. The Germans still fought with unshaken resolve, But their allies' collapse weighed heavily. Instead of a vast coalition, they now stood nearly alone, pressed on all sides. Humphrey's centre pinned them in front, while Norman cavalry wheeled around their flanks. From Civitate's walls, townsfolk saw what had once looked like divine triumph turn into disaster. The Pope himself, within the safety of the town, prayed fervently. His soldiers, though still courageous, were being hemmed in, their advantage in numbers erased by Norman discipline. The clash thundered on, but the tide had turned. For the first time, German knights looked not invincible but isolated. Their line, once fortress-like, began to bend. The Normans, relentless, smelled victory. The Pope's host, which had marched south in glory, now staggered under the weight of ruin. By afternoon, the field of Civitate belonged to the Normans. The Lombards were gone, broken, and scattered. The Germans still fought, but their circle grew tighter with every clash. Exhaustion weighed heavy. Horses stumbled. Men bled into the dust. Robert Guiscard pressed his reserve again and again, hammering at the edges. Humphrey's centre gave no rest. Richard cut off escape. The Germans, proud to the last, chose death over surrender. They formed a final shield wall, singing hymns, even as lances splintered their defences. One by one they fell defiant until silence smothered their voices. When the dust cleared, the papal army was annihilated. Thousands lay dead, banners of Rome and Lombardy trampled in the dirt. Only Civitate's walls sheltered the Pope, who now stood captive, not by chains, but by circumstance. The Normans had won. Against overwhelming numbers, they had crushed the Pope's host. Their courage, discipline, and cunning had turned certain defeat into stunning triumph. The field stank of blood and sweat, of broken faith and shattered pride. Civitate was no longer just a town. It was a name carved forever into the annals of history when the battlefield fell silent. Civitate itself remained. Behind its walls, Pope Leo IX prayed, the sound of hymns from the German dead still ringing faintly in his ears. He had blessed the army that now lay scattered in blood and dust. God's justice, it seemed, had been written in a hand no papal decree could command. The Normans surrounded the town but did not storm it. They did not need to. They knew the gates would open in time. And indeed, by nightfall, the townsfolk, fearful of Norman wrath, begged their lord to surrender the Pope to the victors. They feared destruction more than sacrilege. When Leo finally stepped forth, dressed not in armor but in the golden robes of his office, the Norman leaders met him with surprising respect. They bowed their heads, not as men bow to a pope, but as soldiers bow to a worthy adversary. Robert Guiscard and Humphrey kissed his ring. Richard of Aversa assured him no harm would come. Yet captivity it was. Leo, the shepherd, was now a guest prisoner among the very wolves he had sought to banish. His authority remained, but its power lay chained by reality. Civitate had turned a reforming pope into a bargaining piece. That night, while the wounded moaned and priests whispered last rites over the fallen, the Normans feasted. Fires crackled, wine poured, and roasted meat filled the air. Victory, hard-won and bloody, demanded celebration. Robert Guiscard sat among his captains, recounting the charge that shattered the Lombards. Richard of Aversa boasted of his feigned retreat and the trap it set. Humphrey, quieter, gave thanks that their discipline had held against overwhelming numbers. Songs rose, harsh, guttural Norman chants that carried across the darkened fields. The men toasted each other, their banners planted proudly over the ruins of papal standards. To them, Civitate was not merely survival. It was proof that destiny favored them. Yet even in triumph there was unease. Many dead lay unburied, and the stench of blood drifted across the camp. Some knights wondered whether God truly smiled upon their cause, or if they had merely outmatched men who trusted too much. in blessings. Still, victory silenced doubt. They had faced the Pope himself and emerged unbroken. Tonight they feasted as conquerors. Tomorrow they would decide how to use their prize. For the survivors of the papal army, there was no feast, only silence and sorrow. The Lombards who fled crowded roads and villages, carrying tales of disaster. Families searched for sons who would never return. Priests wept over broken relics and lost soldiers. The Swabians, those who survived the final stand, were prisoners now. Bound, bloodied, but unbowed, they marched under Norman guard. Their captors treated them with a soldier's respect, but humiliation weighed heavier than chains. They had fought with valor, yet valor had not spared them defeat. In Civitate itself, townsfolk grieved. The fields around their homes had become cemeteries. They mourned neighbors, kin, and the ruin of their land. War had not chosen sides. Its cruelty had struck all alike. And in Rome, when word spread of Civitate, grief turned to shock. A pope had marched with an army and returned not as a victor, but as a prisoner. For the faithful, the sorrow was not just for the dead, but for the papacy itself. Now humbled before the Normans, Civitate, the quiet town on a hill, would never again be just another name on a map. Its fields were scarred, its walls shaken, its people broken by the weight of history thrust upon them. The Normans did not burn it. Why destroy a place that had delivered the Pope into their hands? Instead, Civitate became a stage for negotiation, a reluctant host to victors and vanquished alike. Its streets filled with soldiers, its taverns with foreign tongues, its churches with whispered prayers of mercy. Forty folks and be pious to festify. For the townsfolk, life went on, but forever changed. Where once they had tended fields, now they buried the dead. Where once their town had been a quiet Lombard outpost, now it was known across Europe. Civitate's fate was not destruction, but memory. Its name would live long after its wounds had healed, remembered as the place where the Pope fell into Norman hands and where Christendom itself trembled. Pope Leo IX, though a prisoner, remained the Pope. The Normans knew this, and they treated him with honor, even reverence. Yet their respect was sharpened by necessity. Leo was now their leverage in the great game of power. The Pope sat with Norman lords in council, his golden robes shining in dim firelight. He spoke of peace, of restoring order, of reconciling Rome with the warriors who now dominated southern Italy. The Normans listened, nodding, but they knew that their swords had already spoken. Civitate had proven that the papacy could not simply banish them by decree. Still, they desired legitimacy. A treaty signed by the Pope could turn them from brigands into lords recognized by Christendom. So they negotiated, not as humble subjects, but as victors. For months, Leo remained in Norman custody, his captivity more gilded than brutal. He prayed, counseled, and wrote letters to Rome, while the Normans pressed him to acknowledge their conquests. In time, compromise would be reached, but Civitate had shifted the balance forever. The papacy could no longer command. It would have to negotiate. In the smoke-stained memory of Civitate, one name rose brightest: Robert Guiscard. Though Humphrey of Hauteville was the senior commander, it was Robert's ferocity and cunning that defined the Norman victory. His charge at the Lombard flank had broken the papal army's spine. And his cool control of the reserve had sealed the fate of the day. After Civitate, Robert's reputation soared. Lords and knights rallied to his banner, eager to serve the man who had defied the Pope and lived. He was no longer just a younger son of a Norman adventurer. He was a leader, destined to carve kingdoms from chaos. Ambition coursed through him like fire. Within years, Robert would claim the title of Duke of Apulia and Calabria, transforming from mercenary captain into near sovereign. Civitate had been the crucible, in which his destiny was forged. The world now whispered his name with awe and fear. To some, he was the savior of Norman fortunes. To others, the very devil made flesh, but none could deny that Civitate was his triumph. And from that day forth, Robert Guiscard was a man Europe could not ignore. The victory at Civitate was not just a battle won. It was a foundation laid. From their footholds in Apulia and Calabria, the Normans expanded steadily. Fortresses rose on hilltops, castles crowned ridges, and fields once sown with Lombard grain now fed Norman lords. The Italians who once hired Normans as mercenaries now bent to them as rulers. Villages paid tribute. Bishops sought their protection. Even rival powers, Byzantines and Lombards alike, were forced to reckon with the new masters of southern Italy. What set the Normans apart was not only their martial might, but their adaptability. They intermarried with local nobility, adopted Italian customs, and even patronized churches and monasteries. They were conquerors, yes, but also builders. Civitate had given them legitimacy through fire. From its ashes, they built a realm that would, in time, stretch beyond Italy to Sicily, and even challenge the Byzantine Empire itself. The Norman legacy in Italy was not merely survival. It was dominion. For Pope Leo IX, Civitate was a scar carved deep into the papacy. Never before had a pope led an army into battle, and never before had one been taken captive by his enemies. His intentions had been righteous: defend Christendom, curb Norman ambition. But the outcome was humiliation. In Rome, whispers spread. Some said God had punished papal pride. Others feared the Pope had gambled divine authority on swords instead of prayers. His months in Norman custody became a symbol of the papacy's fragility, though the Normans treated him with honor. The fact remained, the Vicar of Christ had been humbled by warriors once branded brigands. When Leo was finally released, he returned to Rome in sorrow. He entered the city not as a triumphant shepherd, but as a chastened prisoner set free. Though still revered as a reformer, Civitate cast a shadow across his legacy. The papacy would recover in time, but the memory of Civitate lingered. A reminder that even the Pope could bleed, and that authority was not invincible when measured against the iron will of men on horseback. The consequences of Civitate reached far beyond the battlefield. In its wake, the Church itself felt tremors of division. Many clergy questioned whether popes should wield swords at all. Was not the papal throne meant for prayer and doctrine, not lances and armies? Some cardinals argued that Leo's defeat proved the Church's need for spiritual, not military strength. Others, however, saw Civitate as a warning. Unless the papacy could command armies, it would forever be vulnerable to secular lords. The debate split bishops, priests, and faithful alike. In monasteries, monks wrote bitter verses condemning the pride that led to Civitate. In courts, kings whispered that the Pope was no longer supreme but fallible. And in the East, the Byzantine Church, already strained in relations with Rome, looked on with smug satisfaction. The Church did not collapse, but Civitates deepened the cracks. When the Great Schism came just 1 year later, splitting East and West, the humiliation of Civitate echoed in every council chamber. The papacy was still powerful, but it was no longer untouchable. From the wreckage of Civitate, seeds were sown that would grow into something greater than any had foreseen. The Normans, once mercenaries, now stood as rulers. Their victory gave them confidence to dream not just of counties and duchies, but of kingdoms and empires. Robert Guiscard would soon march against Byzantium. His kinsmen would cross the seas to Sicily, driving out Saracens and forging a kingdom that blended Norman, Lombard, Arab and Greek cultures. Within decades, the Normans of Italy would stand as one of the most formidable powers in Europe. Civitate had shown them what was possible. If they could defeat the Pope's army, if they could survive the wrath of Christendom itself, then nothing was beyond reach. For the Papacy, too, Civitate planted seeds of caution, of reform, of alliances. No longer would popes march alone into battle. They would learn to wield diplomacy, excommunications, and alliances with kings as their weapons. Thus, Civitate was not just an ending, it was a beginning, a spark that would ignite wars, kingdoms, and dreams of empire. In the taverns of Italy, in the halls of Rome, and in monasteries far from Civitate, the question echoed, what were the Normans? Were they warriors chosen by God, or mercenaries, bound only by coin and ambition? To their followers, they were liberators, strong men who brought order to a land fractured by Lombard rivalries and Byzantine weakness. Their victories proved in Norman eyes that divine favor shone upon them. How else could so few defeat so many? But to their enemies they were wolves in Christian clothing. They prayed in chapels, but plundered villages. They swore loyalty, but shifted allegiance. When coin or opportunity beckoned, could such men truly serve God, or did they merely serve themselves? Chroniclers struggled. Some painted them as new crusaders, preparing the way for later holy wars. Others condemned them as opportunists, more dangerous than the Saracens they once fought against. At Civitate, both visions had lived. The Normans prayed before charging, yet pursued fleeing men without mercy. They bowed to the Pope they had captured, yet forced him into their service. Perhaps the truth was both. They were warriors of God when it suited them, mercenaries when it did not. And in that tension, the Normans found their power. Civitate had revealed a dangerous truth. The sword and the cross could walk hand in hand. The Pope had carried the cross into battle, and the Normans had carried their swords under the shadow of the cross. Both sides believed heaven smiled upon them. Yet only one walked away victorious. The question was eternal. Can faith bless violence? For centuries the Church had preached peace, yet priests marched with armies. Blessing steel meant to pierce flesh. Civitate sharpened this paradox into a blade of its own. Some priests declared the Normans heretics, guilty of defiling holy law. Others insisted that their victory proved God had chosen them as instruments of his will. After all, was not Israel once saved by warriors like David? Was not Constantine's empire baptized by battle? For the common people, the debate mattered little. They saw churches burned, fields trampled, families slain, and they wondered whether the cross still meant salvation or conquest. The sword and the cross remained bound. At Civitate, both had been raised high, and in the dust, both had been stained red. Civitate taught bitter lessons about loyalty. The Pope had marched with a coalition of Germans, Lombards, and Italians. But when the Lombards broke, loyalty shattered. Their flight doomed the papal cause, leaving the Germans to die alone. The Normans, by contrast, stood united, though often fractious and ambitious. At Civitate, they rode as one. Humphrey, Robert, and Richard put rivalry aside and trusted each other in battle. That loyalty, not to Rome, not to kings, but to brothers in arms, became the bedrock of their victory. Chroniclers recorded how Norman knights never abandoned one another, even when surrounded. They fought in tight ranks, their discipline unshaken. Their bond was forged in exile, in hunger, in years of fighting, as mercenaries where betrayal meant death. For the papal army, loyalty was thin, bound by contracts, by faith, by promises. But loyalty tested in fear often breaks. For the Normans, Loyalty was not written but lived, and Civitate became its proof. The lesson echoed for centuries. Armies of many banners often fall to armies of one heart. Ambition had drawn the Pope to Civitate. He sought to curb Norman power, to unify Italy under papal authority. His vision was righteous, but his reach exceeded his grasp. Civitate was the cost. Ambition had also driven the Normans. They dreamed not of survival, but of dominion. To seize lands, titles, and glory, they risked everything against a host that outnumbered them 3-1. Their victory rewarded ambition, but it also bound them to greater risks. In the years ahead, the price of ambition is always blood. Thousands lay dead in Civitate's fields, farmers, knights, priests, and mercenaries alike. Few had chosen ambition, yet many paid its price. For Robert Guiscard, ambition would carry him even further, to Sicily, to war with Byzantium, to the edge of empire. But the memory of Civitate lingered as a warning. Ambition wins crowns, but crowns are forged in graves. When Civitate ended, peace did not follow. Instead, it revealed just how fragile peace truly was. For years, southern Italy had been a cauldron of rivalries. Byzantine governors, Lombard dukes, Saracen raiders, papal envoys. Civitate ended one conflict but ignited many more. The Pope and the Normans made a truce, but trust was thin. Rome feared. The Normans would one day march on the eternal city itself. The Normans feared Rome would call another coalition to destroy them. Suspicion poisoned every negotiation. For the people, peace meant little. Soldiers still roamed roads, castles rose like thorns on hillsides, and fields bore scars of fire. Civitate had proven that armies could appear overnight, and that towns could be ruined in a single day. Peace, they learned, was not the natural state of Italy. It was a pause between storms. Civitate was one such pause, and in its silence, men sharpened their swords again. Long after the dust settled, the memory of Civitate lingered like a scar across Europe. For the Normans, it became a story of triumph, a proof of their valor and cunning. For the Papacy, it was a humiliation rarely spoken aloud, but never forgotten. In monasteries, scribes recorded the tale, some praising the courage of the German knights who stood to the last, others condemning the pride that had led a pope into battle. Songs carried the story to distant lands, altered with every retelling. Sometimes the Normans were devils, sometimes heroes. In Civitate itself, memory was etched deeper than ink. Children grew up, playing on fields where bones still lay beneath the soil. Old men told stories of the day the Pope himself had walked their streets as a captive. The town would never again be just another dot on a map. Memory is not neutral. It shapes the future. Civitate reminded kings that popes could bleed, reminded armies that discipline could outweigh numbers, and reminded all of Christendom that war leaves wounds no prayer can fully heal. In taverns, marketplaces, and noble courts, minstrels sang of Civitate. Their voices carried the story farther than any chronicle. They sang of Norman bravery, of the Pope's sorrow, of German valor. They embroidered details, heroes charging alone, miracles flashing across the field, banners that glowed like fire in the sky. Each singer chose his truth. To Norman lords the songs praised discipline and courage. To Lombard audiences they lamented betrayal and shame. To German listeners they honored the fallen as martyrs of faith. Even in distant France, tales of Civitate inspired awe at how a handful of Normans had humbled the might of Rome. Songs made the battle larger than life. In music, defeat became tragedy, and victory became legend. Civitate became not only history, but myth. And so, long after the last survivor had died, Civitate still lived, in strings, in voices, in the hearts of those who had never seen the town yet. yet felt its echo in song. Time is the greatest judge, and Civitate stood before its court. Historians and chroniclers weighed the battle not merely as a clash of arms, but as a symbol. Some judged Pope Leo harshly, reckless for leading an army against seasoned warriors, guilty of pride that led to disaster. Others saw him as a man of courage, willing to fight for his vision of Christendom, even at great risk. The Normans, too, faced history's verdict. Some remembered them as conquerors, ruthless and greedy. Others as founders who brought stability, law, and strength to a fractured land. History rarely speaks with one voice. Civitate was both a victory and a tragedy, a humiliation and a triumph, a beginning and an end. Its judgment changed with the age, but its significance never faded. Even centuries later, scholars debated what Civitate meant. The failure of papal arms, the rise of Norman power, the stubborn courage of the Swabians. Civitate remained not just a battle, but a mirror in which every generation saw its own truth. The echoes of Civitate did not end in Etienne-Ling-Wucersan. They rippled through time, shaping wars and politics long after. The Normans, emboldened, went on to conquer Sicily and challenge the Byzantines. Their descendants carried their ambition even farther, into crusades, into kingdoms, into dynasties that would rule across Europe. Civitate was their first great claim, their proof that destiny walked with them. For the Papacy, Civitate was a cautionary tale. Never again would a pope lead armies so directly into the field. Instead, Rome turned to diplomacy, alliances, and spiritual weapons like excommunication. The lesson of Civitate echoed in papal policy for centuries. Even the people of Civitate felt its echo. Pilgrims came to see the battlefield, to pray at makeshift shrines where Swabians fell, to walk the ground where a pope was humbled. The fields whispered the memory to anyone who passed. History is never silent. The clash of hooves and hymns at Civitate still echoed in the corridors of power, in churches, in the hearts of men. Its voice was eternal. At last we return to Civitate, not the town but the idea. Its legacy is more than swords and crowns. It is a lesson written in faith and blood. Civitate showed that even the Pope could be humbled. It showed that discipline and unity could triumph against overwhelming numbers. It showed that ambition, for better or worse, shapes the destiny of nations. For the Normans, it was the first great chapter in their Italian story, a step toward kingdoms and empires. For the Papacy, it was a scar that reshaped its approach to power. For the people, it was a tragedy written on their land and in their memories. The legacy of Civitate lives not just in chronicles, but in every question it raised. Who holds true authority? Church or sword? What is the price of ambition? How fragile is peace? As long as men seek power, as long as faith meets ambition, Civitate will be remembered. The battle ended, but its echo lives on, in stone, in song, in history, and now in you, who have walked this journey across time.